Today we begin a journey to uncover the magnificent, tragic, and unforgettable truth of the woman who was born with everything, a title, staggering beauty, and a Guinness fortune so vast it could bend reality. Her name was Lady Caroline Blackwood, and on paper her life was a fairy tale. But in reality it was a gothic horror story, played out on the world's most glamorous stage. This is the story of her 3 scandalous and destructive marriages to some of the 20th century's greatest minds, including the painter Lucian Freud and the poet Robert Lowell. It's the story of a brilliant writer who used her own family's dark secrets as ink, and a lifelong alcoholic who tried to drown her demons, only to find they could swim. She was the ultimate paradox, a fragile muse and a monstrous manipulator, an aristocrat who thrived in squalor, and a loving mother who terrified her own children. She was the woman Truman Capote, the era's most venomous and insightful observer, perfectly described not as a graceful swan of society, but as a crow with white feathers, a creature of dark intelligence hiding behind a beautiful disguise. To understand the crow, we must first enter the gilded cage she came from, a world of breathtaking beauty and unspeakable coldness. This is the story of her childhood, the story of Clandeboy. Before we meet the family, we must understand the world they inhabited because, in many ways, they were its last, most spectacular specimens. This was the world of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, a Protestant ruling class that had dominated the social and political life of Ireland for centuries. Born of conquest and plantation, they built magnificent country mansions, known as the Big Houses, on vast tracts of land. They saw themselves as Irish, but were seen by the native Irish as English. They were fiercely loyal to the British crown, yet possessed a culture and an accent entirely their own. They were a class of contradictions, living in a state of perpetual, elegant unease. By the time Caroline was born at Clandeboy Estate in 1931, this world was in a state of terminal picturesque decline. The Irish War of Independence and the creation of the Free State in the 1920s had severed their political connection to Britain. They were now a tribe of aristocrats living in a new republic, relics of a colonial past that the rest of the country was trying to forget. Many big houses had been burned during the Revolution. Those that remained, like Clandeboy in Northern Ireland, stood as magnificent isolated islands of a British past in a fiercely independent Irish sea. The writer Elizabeth Bowen, herself a daughter of the ascendancy, perfectly described their psychological state as living in a state of doomed glory. Clandeboy, the Blackwood family seat for centuries, was the very embodiment of this doom and this glory. The family had been not just landowners, but empire builders. Caroline's great-grandfather, the first Marquis of Dufferin and Ava, had been a legendary Victorian diplomat, serving as Governor-General of Canada, and, most prestigiously, Viceroy of India. He was Queen Victoria's right-hand man, a living symbol of the British Empire at its zenith. The house Caroline grew up in was less a home and more a museum of this imperial past. Its rooms were crammed with exotic artifacts, gifts from Maharajas, Burmese tapestries, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors who stared down from the walls, their gazes a constant, silent reminder of a glorious, burdensome history. But by Caroline's childhood, the glory was fading fast, leaving only the burden. The sheer cost of maintaining such a colossal estate in the 20th century meant that a kind of grand, theatrical poverty was setting in. The roof might leak, the plumbing might groan, the vast rooms might be freezing cold, but the facade of aristocratic life with its armies of servants and formal dinners had to be maintained at all costs. It was a world of immense, suffocating privilege, built on a foundation of creeping decay. This was the strange, contradictory inheritance Caroline was born into, a legacy of imperial grandeur and a present reality of crumbling stone and chilling drafts. Into this world of faded Blackwood glory crashed the explosive modern energy of new money. It came in the form of Caroline's mother, Maureen Guinness. If the Blackwoods represented the old landed aristocracy, the Guinnesses were Irish royalty of a different sort. What had started in 1759 with Arthur Guinness and a 9,000-year lease on a small brewery at St. James's Gate in Dublin had by the 20th century evolved into a global dynasty. The Guinness family was more than just rich. They were a cultural and philanthropic force, a Protestant clan whose wealth and influence were woven into the very fabric of Irish life. The family had a particular reputation for producing brilliant, eccentric, and often very difficult women, and Maureen and her two sisters, Aileen and Una, were the apotheosis of this tradition. Known as the Guinness Golden Girls, they were the society superstars of the 1920s and 30s. Fabulously wealthy, impossibly glamorous, and famously witty, they dominated the social columns from London to Paris. They married aristocrats, hosted legendary parties, and lived lives of dazzling, decadent spectacle. But beneath the glittering surface, there was a streak of iron-willed selfishness and a capacity for breathtaking emotional cruelty. They were raised to be ornaments, and they learned that charm and wit were weapons to be used to get exactly what they wanted. Maureen was considered the most brilliant and the most difficult of the three. Her marriage to Basil Blackwood, the fourth Marquess of Dufferin and Ava, was a perfect union of old title and new money. She brought the Guinness fortune to prop up the crumbling walls of Clandeboye, and he gave her the ancient, respected title she craved. On paper, they were a perfect match. In reality, they were two profoundly damaged people who created a home utterly devoid of warmth and affection. Caroline's father, Basil, was a man of gentle disposition and quiet integrity, but he was fundamentally broken by history. During the Second World War, he was captured by the Japanese in Burma and spent years in a brutal prisoner of war camp. He endured starvation, disease, and unspeakable cruelty. He survived, but the man who returned to Clandeboye was a ghost, hollowed out by what he had seen. His trauma manifested as a profound, impenetrable silence. He would wander the vast estate for hours, a remote and sorrowful figure, incapable of bridging the emotional gulf that separated him from his own children. He was a constant physical presence, but an emotional void. His silence was a form of abandonment, creating a vacuum at the heart of the family. It was a vacuum that his wife, Maureen, filled with the sheer force of her personality. If her husband was a ghost, Maureen was a tempest. She was a celebrated beauty and a legendary hostess, but at home she was a tyrant. Her wit, so admired in public, became a weapon of surgical cruelty in private, and her children, Caroline, her brother Sheridan, and her sister Perdita, were her most frequent targets. The engine of this cruelty was alcohol. Maureen was a prodigious, lifelong alcoholic, and the atmosphere at Clandeboye was dictated by the level of gin in her system. The children learned to navigate her moods like sailors in a hurricane, developing a hypervigilance, a radar for impending emotional violence. One moment, she could be dazzlingly charming. The next, she would unleash a torrent of verbal abuse. She would mock Caroline for being bookish and plain, comparing her unfavorably to more socially graceful girls. She saw her daughter's burgeoning intellect not as a gift to be nurtured, but as a social handicap, a strange and vaguely threatening rebellion against the world of pretty, thoughtless debutantes she was supposed to join. There's a story that perfectly captures the chilling nature of their childhood. The children were once playing with a chemistry set, a gift meant to foster their intellect. When Maureen discovered it, she flew into a rage, not because it was dangerous, but because she found it pretentious. She smashed the set to pieces, screaming that they were putting on airs, trying to be something they weren't. In that one violent act, the message was clear. Your minds are not your own. Your curiosity is a threat. You exist only to reflect my glory. The household was run by a revolving door of nannies and governesses who were often the only sources of warmth the children knew, but who were frequently fired on a whim by their volatile mistress. Love was not a currency that was traded at Clandeboy. Affection was seen as a weakness, a messy, inconvenient emotion. Performance was what mattered. You were expected to be witty at the dinner table, to be charming to your parents' important guests, to never, ever show vulnerability. Caroline, a sensitive and fiercely intelligent child, learned her lessons well. She learned to build a fortress around her own heart. She sharpened her own wit until it became a defensive weapon, a way to strike first before she could be struck. She learned to see the aristocratic world she was born into as a hollow sham, a beautiful stage set for a play about nothing. The coldness of Clandeboy seeped into her bones, leaving her with a lifelong hunger for an intensity and a reality that she could not find within its crumbling walls. Her entire life would become a series of frantic, often self-destructive attempts to escape. And her official entry into her mother's world, her debutante season, would be the final push she needed to run for her life. Caroline did not slip quietly out of her gilded cage. She blasted her way out. Her formal coming out as a debutante in 1949 was the first and last time she would ever play by her mother's rules. It was a tedious, absurd ritual of being presented at court and attending a series of relentlessly dull balls, all designed with the single mercantile purpose of finding a suitable aristocratic husband to merge her fortune with his title. Caroline endured it all with a look of barely concealed contempt. Her sharp, ironic observations about the whole charade unnerving her fellow debutantes and their ambitious mothers. While they were dreaming of country estates and respectable futures, Caroline was dreaming of something else entirely, a life that was real, a life that was messy, a life that was dangerous. In short, a life that was the absolute opposite of Clandeboy. And so she fled. Not to Paris or Rome, the traditional finishing schools for young ladies of her class, but to the messy, vibrant, and thrillingly authentic heart of London's bohemian underworld. This was not the London of her parents, a world of exclusive clubs in Mayfair and formal dinners in Belgravia. This was the London of Soho and Fitzrovia, a city within a city that was shaking off the gray dust of war and exploding with a raw, new creative energy. It was a world of smoky pubs like the French House and the Wheat Sheaf, where poets argued until closing time, of private drinking dens like the Gargoyle Club and the Colony Room, run by the famously foul-mouthed Muriel Belcher, where the laws of time and social convention seemed to melt away in a haze of gin and cigarette smoke. It was a world of cheap, paint-splattered artist studios where the future of British art was being forged in a crucible of poverty, genius, and cheap wine. This world was a loose confederation of brilliant, hard-drinking, and often profoundly self-destructive talents. There was the painter Francis Bacon, holding court at the Colony Room, his tongue as savage and as brilliant as his canvases. There was the tormented artist John Minton, whose drawings captured the fragile beauty of the era's young men, and the great Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, a rollicking, doomed, drunken poet who was steadily drinking his way to an early grave. It was a world that ran on a high-octane fuel of ambition, sex, and intellectual combat. It was grimy, it was dangerous, and to Caroline, it was the most beautiful, most liberating place on earth. Here, a title was an amusing curiosity. A trust fund was only useful for buying the next round of drinks. What mattered was intelligence, originality, and the courage to live without a safety net. For the first time in her life, Caroline felt she had found her tribe. Into this world, she arrived like a creature from another planet. With her ethereal, haunted beauty, her clipped aristocratic accent, and the almost visible aura of her Guinness wealth, she was an instant object of fascination. But she was no mere society-slumming tourist. She had a toughness and an intelligence that allowed her to hold her own amongst these formidable personalities. She wasn't looking for a thrill. She was looking for a new reality, an experience so intense it would burn away the cold, hollow feeling of her childhood. And she would find the very center of that reality in a man who was widely considered to be the most intense, most brilliant, and most dangerous artist in all of London. His name was Lucian Freud. Lucian Freud was not just a man, he was a weather system. The grandson of the legendary Sigmund Freud, he carried the weight and the power of that name with a kind of arrogant nonchalance. He had escaped Nazi Berlin with his family as a boy, and he retained the wary, feral instincts of a perpetual outsider. By his late 20s, he was already a titan of the London art world, a painter of such brutal, unflinching honesty that his portraits felt less like depictions and more like psychological excavations. He painted flesh as if it were meat, rendering every vein, pore, and imperfection with an almost cruel precision. He painted his subjects' souls with the same dispassionate, analytical gaze his grandfather had used on their neuroses. He was also, by all accounts, a creature of ferocious and unpredictable appetites. His friend, the artist Maggie Hambling, said he exuded danger. He was a notorious womanizer, leaving a trail of broken hearts and illegitimate children across London. He was an obsessive gambler, known to get into fistfights with gangsters and to wager and lose staggering sums of money, often belonging to other people. He was fiercely private, intensely charismatic, and possessed a gaze so penetrating that people felt he could see straight through them to their most shameful secrets. He was, in short, everything that the polite, repressed world of Clandeboy was not. He was raw, he was real, and he was thrillingly, terrifyingly alive. Their meeting was a collision of two worlds, a chemical reaction that was both inevitable and explosive. He was 29, she was just 20. He was immediately captivated by what he saw. It wasn't just her beauty, though he was drawn to her pale skin, her slender frame, and those enormous melancholy eyes that he would later describe as enormous and duck-egg blue. It was the contradiction she embodied. She was a titled aristocrat who dressed in bohemian rags, a great heiress who seemed utterly indifferent to her wealth. He saw the deep well of sadness and vulnerability behind her cool, witty facade. And to a painter like Freud, who was obsessed with the hidden truths beneath the surface of things, she was the ultimate, irresistible subject. He told a friend he wanted to marry her because her face was unpaintable, a challenge that drove him wild. She, in turn, was completely mesmerized. In Freud, she found the absolute antithesis of her remote, emotionally absent father. Here was a man whose attention was a laser beam, a man of ferocious passions and absolute certainty. He was a genius, and he knew it. He offered her an escape into a world of high-stakes art and raw emotion, a world where the polite lies of her upbringing had no currency. It was a dangerous attraction, and she knew it, as she later wrote with characteristic understatement. He wasn't just dangerous, he was danger. She fell for him completely. They married in 1953, a union that scandalized both the aristocracy and the art world. Her mother, Maureen, was appalled. She had expected her daughter to marry a duke. Instead, she had chosen a penniless, Jewish, German-born painter with a scandalous reputation. Maureen famously referred to her new son-in-law as the Cretin and did everything in her power to try and stop the marriage and cut off Caroline's access to her trust fund. For Caroline, her mother's apoplectic disapproval was simply the cherry on the cake. The marriage was her ultimate act of rebellion, a final definitive severing of the ties to the world that had tried to suffocate her. Their life together was a masterpiece of romantic chaos, a whirlwind of artistic creation and emotional destruction. They lived in a series of squalid, paint-splattered flats in Paddington, a world of peeling wallpaper and shared bathrooms that was light years away from the stately grandeur of Clandeboye. Caroline's vast trust fund, which she eventually won control of, was a river of cash that flowed directly into Freud's pockets and then onto the betting tables of London's gambling dens. They were perpetually broke, a state of affairs that seemed to thrill Freud, and that Caroline accepted as the price of admission to his world. This wasn't just poverty. For Caroline, it was a deliberate rejection of bourgeois comfort, a radical form of freedom. This wasn't just a marriage. It was an exclusive, all-consuming cult of two. Freud was intensely possessive and pathologically jealous. Convinced that every man was as predatory as he would often lock Caroline in their flat when he went out. He demanded absolute fidelity from her while maintaining a string of his own affairs, which he barely bothered to conceal. He dominated her life completely, dictating who she could see and where she could go. For Caroline, who had fled the gilded cage of her family, this new life was beginning to look like a different kind of prison, one built not of stone walls and social etiquette, but of raw, untethered, and often violent emotion. But it was a prison in which she was, for the first time in her life, the absolute and singular focus of a genius's attention. And nowhere was that attention more intense, more focused, and more revealing than in his studio. During their marriage, Caroline became Freud's most important muse. His obsession with her translated into a series of portraits that are now considered among the greatest masterpieces of 20th century art. And to look at them is to read the secret, tragic history of their love affair. Look at this painting. It's called Girl in Bed from 1952. Here is Caroline, engulfed in a turbulent sea of white sheets, her face pale, her lips slightly parted, her huge dark eyes wide, with a look of profound, almost unbearable anxiety. She is not resting. She is trapped. She looks like a beautiful, wounded creature caught in the headlights of Freud's intense analytical gaze. The brushstrokes themselves are tight, controlled, almost claustrophobic. Freud isn't just painting a portrait. He is performing a psychological dissection, laying bare his wife's fragility and fear for all the world to see. The process of creating these paintings was an ordeal. Caroline would have to sit for him for hundreds of hours, holding a pose in utter silence while Freud subjected her to his relentless, unblinking scrutiny. He worked slowly, meticulously, his concentration absolute. For Caroline, this was both a kind of heaven and a kind of hell. She was finally receiving the focused, undivided attention that she had craved her entire life, the attention her parents had never given her. But to live under that microscope, day in and day out, to have your every flaw, your every flicker of emotion recorded and analyzed by your husband's cold, brilliant eye, was an unbearable pressure. She felt both seen and impaled. Perhaps the most devastating portrait of their marriage is this one, Hotel Bedroom, painted in 1954. It's a double portrait, a depiction of the couple in a drab Parisian hotel room, but it is a portrait of complete and utter alienation. Caroline lies in bed, her face turned away, her expression remote and desolate. She seems to be staring into a private abyss. Freud stands in the foreground, his face obscured by shadow, a menacing, predatory silhouette. They occupy the same small room, but they are 1,000,000 miles apart. It is a painting about the death of intimacy, a chilling depiction of the emotional gulf that had opened up between them. The passion that had once consumed them had burned out, leaving only ash and a cold, shared loneliness. The marriage, which had begun with such a ferocious romantic blaze, was inevitably doomed. The sheer intensity could not be sustained. Freud's relentless infidelities became more brazen and more wounding. He began a long-term affair with another of his models, Susie Boyd, who would eventually bear him several children. The chaos, the jealousy, and the psychological warfare of their life together had finally taken their toll on Caroline. She suffered a complete nervous breakdown, a collapse brought on by years of living at an impossible emotional pitch. She realized with the clarity that can only come from absolute despair that she had to escape once more. The man who had been her savior from the world of Clandeboy had become her tormentor. The freedom she had sought in his arms had become a more subtle and perhaps more damaging form of bondage. In 1958, after 6 years of a marriage that had defined an era in British art, they divorced. Caroline Blackwood, at the age of 27, was adrift. She had successfully escaped her family. She had now, at great personal cost, escaped her first great destructive love. Bruised and psychologically battered, she fled England, this time seeking refuge across the Atlantic. She was not looking for another storm. This time, she was looking for a safe harbor, for a life of quiet, respectable, and perhaps even boring stability. But for a soul as restless as hers, the illusion of peace would prove to be the most dangerous trap of all. The woman who arrived in America in the late 1950s was a refugee from the inferno of her own life. The marriage to Lucian Freud had been an act of total emotional immolation, a fire that had burned away her youthful naivety and left her scarred, exhausted, and profoundly weary. She had sought out the most intense experience London had to offer and had barely survived it. Her nervous breakdown was not just a collapse, it was a revelation. It taught her that her attraction to danger, to the brilliant feral chaos that Freud embodied, was a form of self-destruction, and so she made a conscious, almost clinical decision to seek out its opposite. She was not looking for passion, she was looking for peace. She was not looking for a genius who would put her on a canvas. She was looking for a good man who would put her at ease. This quest for sanctuary was a rejection of everything her life had been thus far. It was a rejection of the cold, aristocratic drama of Clandeboy, and it was a rejection of the hot, bohemian chaos of Paddington. America, in this era, seemed to offer a third way, a life of the mind that was serious but not savage, a world of intellectualism that was grounded in the new secular religion of psychoanalysis and a structured academic social order. She was, in essence, looking for an antidote to Lucian Freud, and in a man named Israel Citkowitz, she believed she had found one. Israel Citkowitz was, in almost every conceivable way, Lucian Freud's polar opposite. Born in Russia and raised in Brooklyn, he was a brilliant and highly respected, though not widely famous, composer and pianist. He had been a child prodigy, and as a young man, he had studied in Paris with the legendary Nadia Boulanger, the great and formidable teacher who had shaped the minds of a generation of American composers, from Aaron Copland to Philip Glass. Citkowitz was a key member of that intellectual circle, a man of immense culture, kindness, and a quiet, steadying gravity. He was 22 years older than Caroline, a man who had already lived a full life in the world of music and ideas. Where Freud was a whirlwind of unpredictable instinct, Citkowitz was a creature of deep thought and gentle discipline. Where Freud's gaze was a predatory interrogation, Sitkowitz's was warm and reassuring. He was not a danger, he was a haven. They married in 1959, and Caroline threw herself into the role of the respectable intellectual's wife with the same total commitment she had once given to the role of the bohemian muse. She was consciously building a life that was the negative image of the one she'd had with Freud. They bought a large, elegant house in Rhinebeck, upstate New York, a place of order and quiet beauty surrounded by rolling hills and academic communities like Bard College. And for the first time, Caroline became a mother. She had 3 daughters in quick succession: Natalia in 1960, Evgenia in 1964, and Ivana in 1966. On the surface, she had finally achieved the normalcy she had never known. She had a loving, stable husband, beautiful children, a lovely home. She was, for all intents and purposes, a respectable American matron, the chatelaine of a civilized intellectual salon. But the crow cannot for long pretend to be a songbird, nesting in a quiet suburban tree. The very peace and stability that Caroline had so desperately sought soon began to feel like a new and more subtly suffocating kind of cage. The ordered domestic life was a costume that simply did not fit. She was, by her own admission, a terrible housewife, utterly unsuited to the practical demands of cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing, tasks she mostly delegated to hired help. The ferocious, cutting wit that had been her currency in the pubs of Soho now had no appropriate outlet. When deployed at a quiet academic dinner party or against her mild-mannered husband, it seemed merely cruel. As her daughter Evgenia would later write, her mother's wit needed a war zone to really blaze. In the peaceful landscape of Rhinebeck, it just started fires. The quiet of her new life created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, her old companions, boredom and anxiety, rushed back in, and she fought them with the only weapon she had ever found to be consistently effective: alcohol. Her drinking, which had been a feature of her life with Freud, now became its central organizing principle. It was a way to numb the crushing ennui of a life without high drama, a way to blur the edges of a reality she was beginning to find unbearable. The quiet country evenings were filled not with domestic bliss, but with the clinking of ice in a glass and the slow, steady slide into oblivion. However, this period of domestic desperation was not a total wasteland. In the quiet, lonely hours in her beautiful, ordered house, when the children were asleep and the silence pressed in, Caroline began to write. Seriously. She had dabbled before, but now writing became her lifeline, an escape not into a man or a scene, but into the vast, undiscovered country of her own mind. She began writing sharp, insightful, and often darkly funny journalism for prestigious publications like The New Statesman, The Sunday Times, and The Saturday Evening Post. She wrote with an insider's anthropological eye about the eccentricities of the English aristocracy. She wrote with chilling precision about the trial of the Moors murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, delving into the psychology of evil. She wrote with a unique and fearless perspective about the simmering sectarian violence of Ulster, a world she knew from her childhood but could now analyze with an outsider's clarity. Her prose was like her conversation, elegant, precise, and capable of suddenly unsheathing a blade of shocking cruelty or breathtaking insight. In writing, she found a way to process the world, to impose an order on its chaos, and to deploy her formidable intelligence in a way that was entirely her own. She was no longer just a subject for a great artist. She was becoming an artist herself. This newfound identity as a writer gave her a confidence and a sense of purpose that her domestic life could not. And it made her realize that the safe harbor she had chosen with Israel Citkowitz was, in fact, an elegant place to slowly drown. The marriage built on the premise of peace slowly died of a lack of oxygen. She had not been built for peace. She was a creature of the storm. And in 1970, after more than a decade of calm, she sailed directly into the heart of a hurricane. His name was Robert Lowell, but his friends called him Cal. He was by any and every measure the most important American poet of his generation, a living monument in the landscape of 20th century literature. He was a poet of staggering intellect and raw, unsparing honesty. He had invented what came to be known as confessional poetry, a style that broke down the barriers between a poet's life and his art, using his own struggles, his own family history, and his own mental breakdowns as the raw material for his work. And like Caroline, he was an aristocrat, a scion of the Boston Lowells, one of the great Brahmin families of New England, a lineage that included poets, university presidents, and generals. He too had grown up in a gilded cage of immense privilege and emotional repression. And most significantly, like Caroline, he was profoundly, brilliantly, and tragically damaged. Lowell suffered from a severe, lifelong case of bipolar disorder. His life was a dramatic, terrifying cycle of euphoric, godlike mania, followed by periods of suicidal, paralyzing depression. His biography was a recurring rhythm of literary triumphs, including 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and involuntary commitments to psychiatric hospitals. He was a man of immense personal charm, dazzling intelligence, and terrifying, unpredictable psychic energy. They met in 1970, and the recognition was instantaneous, a fateful meeting of 2 magnificent wounded animals. He was 53, she was 39. In her, Lowell saw not just a beautiful aristocratic woman, but a mind that could match his own, a fellow survivor of a gilded and tortured upbringing. He saw a wit and a darkness that mirrored his own. In him, Caroline saw the electrifying combination of genius and danger that she had been missing for over a decade. He was not a stable sanctuary like Israel. He was a brilliant, blazing inferno, and she was, as always, drawn to the fire. What followed was one of the great literary scandals of the age. Lowell was at the time married for over 2 decades to the highly respected writer and critic Elizabeth Hardwick, a woman who had been his intellectual partner and his steadfast anchor through countless manic episodes. His decision to leave her for Caroline was a public and brutal act that sent shock waves through the tight-knit literary worlds of New York and London. It was not a quiet separation. It was a high-drama demolition, played out in the letters and gossip columns of their peers. Caroline left Israel Citkowitz, and Lowell left Elizabeth Hardwick. They moved to England together, to Millgate Park, a beautiful country house in Kent, and married in 1972. Their life together was a public spectacle, a 5-act tragedy played out on the world stage. On one level, it was a dazzling intellectual partnership. Their home was a magnet for the literary elite of the English-speaking world. The conversation was brilliant, the wit was savage, the alcohol flowed freely. But beneath this glittering surface, their life was a relentless cycle of his madness and her drinking. Lowell's manic episodes were the stuff of terrifying legend. He would become grandiose, believing he was a historical figure like Alexander the Great or a Roman emperor. He would spend money recklessly, deliver rambling, incoherent public speeches, and become paranoid and violently abusive. Caroline, who had once fled the chaos of Lucian Freud, now found herself in the role of full-time caretaker to a mad genius. It was an exhausting, terrifying role, but one that, on some level, she seemed perversely suited for. She was the only one who could handle him, who could arrange for the doctors and the hospitalizations, who could ride out the terrifying storms of his illness. But the storm took its toll, and Lowell, the ultimate confessional poet, used every agonizing moment as material for his art. In 1973, he published The Dolphin, a collection of poems that chronicled the breakdown of his marriage to Hardwick and the beginning of his new life with Caroline. The book was a literary sensation and won him his second Pulitzer Prize. But it was also an act of profound ethical violation. In the poems, Lowell quoted directly and without permission from the desperate, heartbroken private letters Elizabeth Hardwick had written to him. He had taken her private pain and turned it into public art. Many of their friends were appalled, calling it an unforgivable act of artistic vampirism. But Caroline, who was also a character in this poetic drama, defended him. She was now a part of the literary machine, both a muse and a collaborator in the painful, brilliant project of Robert Lowell's life. Their shared existence was a blur of literary fame, psychiatric wards, and alcoholic blackouts. It was a union of two of the most celebrated minds of their time, but it was a marriage that was, from the very beginning, burning on a fuse that was far too short. The end came with a speed and a tragic symmetry that even a poet as great as Lowell could not have invented. By 1977, after just 5 years, the marriage had completely disintegrated. The relentless cycle of mania, depression, and drinking had exhausted them both. Lowell, frail and increasingly ill, made the decision to leave Caroline and return to the woman who had always been his anchor, Elizabeth Hardwick, in New York. In September of that year, he packed his bags at their London apartment, got into a taxi, and headed for Heathrow Airport. He made it to New York, but on the taxi ride from JFK Airport to Hardwick's apartment, he slumped over on the back seat. He had suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. And here is the final devastating, almost unbelievably tragic detail of their story. When the paramedics opened the taxi door, they found Robert Lowell lifeless. And clutched in his hands was a package, a framed picture he was bringing as a gift. But the portrait in the frame was not of his current wife, Caroline. It was a portrait of his ex-wife, Elizabeth Hardwick. And the artist who had painted it years earlier was Caroline's ex-husband, Lucian Freud. The poet was dead, clutching a portrait of his ex-wife, painted by his new wife's ex-husband. It was a perfect, terrible circle of pain, a nexus of all the great destructive loves of Caroline Blackwood's life. At the age of 45, she was now a 3-time widow, a veteran of 3 campaigns with 3 of the century's most difficult men of genius. The grand dramatic escapes were over. The men who had defined her life were gone. Now she was left utterly and completely alone, with her children, her fortune, and the host of demons that had been her lifelong companions. The final act of her life was about to begin. After Robert Lowell's death, the great dramatic public performances of Caroline Blackwood's life were over. The men who had served as both her anchors and her tormentors, the titanic figures of Freud and Lowell around whom her identity had orbited, were gone. The music had stopped, the guests had gone home, and she was left for the first time in the echoing silence of her own company. At 45, she was a 3-time widow, a mother of 3 adolescent daughters, and a woman facing the terrifying prospect of a life without a leading man to react against. She retreated. Her final stage was a large, rambling house in Sag Harbor. The house, like her, was grand, but slightly dilapidated, a fortress against a world she no longer had the energy to conquer. It was here, in this self-imposed exile, that the final, most tragic, and perhaps most artistically fruitful chapter of her life would unfold. The glamorous, scandalous society figure receded, and in her place, two dominant identities remained, locked in a fight to the death: Caroline the writer and Caroline the alcoholic. Her alcoholism, which had been a constant companion since her days with Freud, now ceased to be a feature of her life and became its central, tyrannical organizing principle. Her days became a blur of blackouts and hangovers, of brilliant, lucid moments of conversation, followed by terrifying descents into incoherent rage or maudlin self-pity. The house in Sag Harbor became a kind of chaotic court, where she would preside, a magnificent, tragic witch, stirring a cauldron of memory and regret. A small, rotating cast of friends, acolytes, and hangers-on would come to visit, drawn by the still dazzling flame of her intellect and wit, but they were often singed by the unpredictable heat of her disease. Her daughter Evgenia has spoken with heartbreaking clarity about the reality of living with her mother during these years. She described a woman who was both the most brilliant person she had ever known and a source of constant terror and embarrassment. There were the drunken car rides, the slurred phone calls, the public scenes. Yet, alongside the chaos, there was a fierce, unconventional love and an intellect that could still, in its moments of clarity, light up the world. She was a mother who could dissect a philosophical argument with breathtaking precision in the afternoon and be unable to stand up by evening. The children learned to be caretakers, to be vigilant, to love their mother not just for who she was, but in spite of who she had become. The great tragedy was that Caroline, who had spent her life fleeing her own cold and distant mother, was now, through the distorting lens of her addiction, inflicting a new kind of trauma on her own children. Yet out of this personal disintegration came a period of astonishing creative focus. In the lonely, hungover mornings in her house by the sea, Caroline Blackwood produced her finest work. The pain, the chaos, and the memories of her past became the raw material she would now refine into the cold, hard gems of her fiction. Writing was no longer just a lifeline. It was her only means of imposing order on the chaos, her only way to get her revenge. In 1977, the same year Lowell died, she published Great Granny Webster, her undisputed masterpiece. The novel is a slim, icy, and utterly brilliant dissection of the emotional landscape of her own aristocratic Anglo-Irish family. The book tells the story of a young woman piecing together the history of her grimly fascinating relatives, dominated by the terrifying figure of the great-grandmother, a matriarch so emotionally frozen she seems barely human. The book is written in a prose style that is spare, elegant, and as chilling as the wind off the Irish Sea. With surgical precision, Caroline peels back the elegant facade of the ascendancy to reveal the moral decay and profound emotional poverty that lay beneath. It is a quiet, devastating act of literary patricide, a final settling of scores with the cold, loveless world of Clandeboy. She took the poison of her childhood and transformed it into a perfect, deadly work of art. She followed this with other notable works, including a chilling piece of nonfiction, The Fate of Mary Rose, about a young Protestant girl caught in the sectarian violence of the Ulster Troubles, and her final novel, Corrigan, another dark tale of psychological manipulation in the Irish countryside. In her writing, she finally definitively proved that she was not just a beautiful face in a famous painting or a character in a famous poem. She was a formidable artist in her own right, a writer with a unique and uncompromising voice. But even as she was achieving this new level of artistic mastery, her personal life was spiraling towards its ultimate tragedy. Her youngest daughter, Ivana, was a beautiful, sensitive, and deeply troubled young woman. Perhaps the most vulnerable of the three sisters, she had inherited the family's predisposition for both brilliance and self-destruction. As a young adult, she fell into heroin addiction, a desperate attempt to numb a pain that seemed to be a birthright, a tragic echo of her mother's own reliance on alcohol. In 1980, while living in London, Ivana died of a drug overdose. She was just 24 years old. The death of her child was the blow from which Caroline would never, ever recover. It was the final, unbearable cruelty in a life that had been defined by loss. The guilt she felt was a monstrous, living thing. She had been a remote, difficult, alcoholic mother, and she tormented herself with the thought that she had somehow failed to save her daughter. The story of what happened next is almost too dark to comprehend, a gothic tale that seems ripped from the pages of one of her own novels. Caroline had Ivana's body cremated and brought the ashes back to her home in Sag Harbor. The small urn became the focal point of her life and her grief. She placed it on the mantelpiece and would spend hours talking to it, weeping over it, raging at it. Her friends and remaining daughters watched in horror, fearing for her sanity. The urn was a constant, morbid reminder of her loss, and they believed it was preventing her from ever moving on. And so, in a well-intentioned but catastrophically misguided act, they conspired to take the urn while Caroline was out and scatter the ashes in a nearby garden. When Caroline returned and discovered that the ashes were gone, she flew into a terrifying primal rage that was beyond anything they had ever seen. She screamed that they had stolen her daughter from her for a second time, that they had taken the last physical piece of Ivana she had left. To her, it was the ultimate act of betrayal and abandonment, a final confirmation of her lifelong fear that everything she loved would eventually be taken from her. From that point on, a vital part of her simply gave up. The brilliant, defiant light in her eyes began to dim, and the long, slow process of her own surrender began. Caroline Blackwood died of cancer in 1996 at the age of 64. She spent her final years as a recluse in her house in Sag Harbor, her body finally succumbing to a lifetime of punishing abuse. She died, much as she had lived, on her own fiercely independent and difficult terms. So what is left behind? When the dust of all the scandals has settled, what is the lasting significance of this beautiful, damaged, and brilliant woman? Her most tangible legacy is her writing, small in quantity but of exceptionally high quality. But her greater significance lies in what her epic, tragic life tells us. Her story is a powerful cautionary tale about the illusion that privilege can protect you from pain. She was born with every advantage, yet her life demonstrates with brutal clarity that no amount of money or status can build a defense against a childhood devoid of love. She embodies the eternal fraught relationship between the artist and the muse. She played the role of the muse to two of the century's greatest artists, but her life shows the immense personal cost of that role. To be a muse is to be an object, to have your identity subsumed by the genius of another. Caroline's entire life can be seen as a struggle against that objectification, her own writing a desperate, brilliant attempt to seize control of her own narrative, to insist that she was the one holding the pen, not just the one being written about. In the end, we are left where we began, with Truman Capote's devastatingly accurate observation. Caroline Blackwood was not a swan. The swans were simple creatures, content to be beautiful, to be admired, to glide on the surface of things. Caroline could never do that. She was too intelligent, too wounded, too restless. She had to dive deep down into the muck and the darkness to pick apart the wreckage of her own life and the lives of those around her. She was a crow with white feathers. The white feathers were the camouflage, the beauty, the title, the Guinness fortune. They were the disguise that allowed her to move through the world of the Swans, unnoticed for what she truly was. But her soul, her mind, her very essence was that of a crow. Dark, sharp-eyed, fiercely intelligent, a survivor who fed on the carrion of her own past, a creature that saw the world with an unflinching and often terrifying clarity. She was not a creature of simple, elegant beauty. Hers was a more difficult, more dangerous, and ultimately a more interesting kind of beauty. It was the beauty of a ruin, the beauty of a storm, the beauty of a life lived without a safety net, in a state of constant, brilliant, and heartbreaking freefall. And that is a story we will never forget.